just officially start this property webinar. And so thank you very much for everyone online. We have Dom from Benari Property who's here and will run through the presentation. I should just say that 2020 being such just a ridiculous year, the way everything's going or has gone, that with interest rates being so low, property is still of interest to everyone, and it's probably the number one inquiry we've had all through 2020 is property. So we just thought now that things are hopefully starting to open up and settle down and so on, that would be good to get Dom's expertise to provide this this presentation. And we'll pass over to him shortly and he'll go through this. And at the end, we'll also be running through some numbers just to show you why property at the moment compared to 5-7 years ago is just so different. And so we'll have a chance for questions, but one of the things for the housekeeping rules for that is if everyone can just please stay on mute. But if there's any questions, we've got the chat function at the very bottom middle of your page, and just put any questions you may have on that. And Rosh, who is monitoring this, will have any questions, and Dom or myself can be able to answer those questions at the end. Or what else other housekeeping could I say? Yep, mute that. Oh, okay, everyone knows where their own bathroom is, so I don't need to say that. So I will pass that over to Dom and welcome you, Dom, and let you go. Thank you very much.
Cool. No, thanks, Mark, and thanks for having me. Appreciate the opportunity, and I think it's quite fitting, like you mentioned, that we sort of look at this at the back end of 2020, as the year's been full of a lot of uncertainty, and I think everyone, we've found that we've had a lot of questions around the property market and sort of what's happening there, and what the effects of COVID are going to be on the property market. And there were a lot of predictions made by sort of the various financial institutions and economists and experts and those types of things. So it's been interesting to see how it's kind of played out over the year and what's actually happened in the property market. And now we can kind of look back on that and sort of get an understanding. But what I'll do just to start with is give everyone a little bit of a background as to what Benari Property actually does. And then I'll sort of talk a little bit about what's happened in 2020 and how COVID's affected the property market, which is probably the more interesting part. And then, like Mark said, we'll give some tips on what we look for when we're looking for investment properties and sort of some of the things that you should avoid when you are looking to purchase an investment property. Because I think, like Mark said, over the next few sort of months and potentially years, there's a really good opportunity for people to get into the property market at a fairly low cost, given the low interest rate environment. And with some of the things that we've seen over that COVID period, there's also an opportunity to get in at a great time from a holding cost perspective, but able to capitalize on some really good capital growth prospects as well. So I'll start going through this. And like Mark mentioned, we've got some time for questions at the end as well. But just to give you a bit of background on Benari Property. So what Benari Property is essentially a property research house or a property research and investment advisory. So the way we work is we're a team of property investment professionals, and typically what we do is we help clients to invest in properties. So people who don't really know where to start, don't really know what to look for, might need a bit of guidance or assistance in finding a property for them to invest in. We kind of help them to point them in the right direction and help them with some recommendations after we've sort of analyzed the market. And the majority of our clients or our investors come from professional partners like Mark. So financial planners, accountants, mortgage brokers, people that are dealing with clients who already might have home loans or are putting together an overall strategy in looking at trying to build wealth or build towards retirement, those types of things. And one of the things that we've found is that a lot of people who go through these strategies with financial planners, if they don't get the right guidance or they're investing in an area that they're unfamiliar with, they can kind of screw up that part of the strategy. So where we've found ourselves to add a lot of value is to help people to find properties that fit within a respective strategy. So that's essentially what we do. And the way we ensure that we're providing the right types of property advice or recommendations is around a pretty stringent research process. Now, my role at Benari Property is head of research. So the way we sort of operate is to base all our decisions or recommendations on a strict research criteria. And one of the overarching sort of things that we look for is trying to identify owner-occupier type properties. Now, the worst thing an investor can do is purchase a property when they get to a point of wanting to invest and buy something that is an investor grade product or would only appeal to another investor. So when you're buying an investment property, the key thing to consider is that when you purchase that property in 10, 15 years time, not only do you want to achieve a great rental throughout that, or a sustained rental with low vacancy throughout that period, but in 10, 15 years time, if you need to sell that property, you want to be able to maximize who that property appeals to when you go to sell that property. And if you buy an investor grade product, you generally only appeal to 20 or 30% of the market, whereas buying an owner occupier product enables you to appeal to the 100% of the market. So that's one of the key things that we look for, and I'll sort of go back to that throughout the presentation. But basically what that means is buying a property, whether it be an apartment, a townhouse, or a house, that's going to appeal to someone who could potentially live in that themselves, because they're the type of people who get emotional about the property, and that enables you to achieve the most capital growth, essentially. So in a nutshell, that's kind of what Benari Property do. And if you have any questions about that, again, we can touch on it at the end. But to get to some of the research factors and kind of what we look for, it's a real top to bottom approach. And for a lot of people who are, working professionals who, have families, are really time poor, sometimes investing in property may not be the best place to invest, maybe outside of your sort of the suburb that you live in. Now, to make sure that you don't make mistakes, there's a lot of research that you need to be doing before you make those decisions. Now, what we do is basically take that out of your hands and we provide you with all the research to help you to make the right decision. So, like I said, it starts from the top. So it starts at market cycles. Now, we're very lucky in Australia, and one thing that COVID has done is it's sort of enabled us to see that there are various markets around the country, and they all perform very differently, and they're all affected by very different factors. So our job is to monitor those various cycles, and we're very lucky in Australia because at one point Sydney might be going through a really strong period, but Brisbane's going through a slower period, but Melbourne's also going through a strong period, but Perth's going through a bit of a downturn. So we've got various property markets that we can look at, and that enables people to, whenever they're looking at investing in property, there may always be a market that's at that point of opportunity. So our job is to identify those markets that are in those points of opportunity. And the way we do that is through firstly looking at market cycles. We monitor economic drivers, employment diversity, infrastructure spending, jobs growth, and they're the types of things that create that sustained demand. If we've seen a lot of people in the past invest in mining towns where they're so reliant on one industry, and when that industry disappears, the demand for property also disappears. So we don't want to be in those volatile markets. The main goal that we find for most of our clients is to buy a property that enables them to create some capital growth, but doesn't involve them changing their lifestyle to afford holding the property. Now, the way to do that is to avoid those areas where you've got, really volatile market conditions and you're at risk of, long-term vacancies. So we sort of do that through our market selection. We look at population growth, the trends around interstate migration, overseas migration, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a few slides. We focus on supply and demand, and that's a really big one too, because basically property price growth and rental demand are all based on the balance of supply and demand in a suburb. If you're in an area where you've got lots and lots of supply coming on, but you don't have that much demand, then you generally don't see those results. If you're in an area where you've got lots of potential for supply, that can sometimes dilute the potential capital growth that you can achieve. So we understand those things, and we do that by looking at local zoning rules, what's to come in terms of new developments and things like that. Demographic profile, understanding who lives in a certain area. Livability. Livability is one of the things that you would automatically do if you were buying a property. You look at how close it is to employment, transport, shops, schools, and restaurants, all the things that are important to you. Quality is the size of the property, the level of finish, the natural light, all those types of things. And then value. We understand the value proposition. Ensure that the properties that we're recommending to clients are in line or below the prices of the properties that are selling in the suburb. Now, one thing which we'll talk about at the end is that we do focus on new property, and the reason we do that is around some tax benefits and our ability to choose the best properties that are available at a given time. Now, new property doesn't mean we're always looking off the plan. A lot of the time it's recently completed property as well, so it's about half-half. But it enables us to choose the best properties within a development rather than being limited to what's on the market at any given time. But it also enables us to get maximum tax benefits, which Mark will discuss at the end. So 2020 so far. So one of the key things that COVID-19 has affected, or one of the key things that was supposed to be a key contributor to how COVID affected the property market, was what COVID would mean for population growth. Now, over the years, one of the key things that's driven Australia's property prices is that overseas migration, and we've always had really strong overseas migration. Now, what's happened during COVID is that you can see the graph on the left. We went from having sort of 230,000 people moving to the country, down to about a negative 72,000 and probably negative 25,000 the following year. So we've seen a real drop off in that net migration. Now, there's no doubt that that's going to have an effect on the market. We've also seen that temporary student visas have fallen just 130 arrivals in October, as opposed to 54,000 last October. So we're seeing a really, really, tightening of the people coming from overseas, which is obviously expected. Now, that doesn't mean that it's all bad news for the property market, because what this means is that it's really important when you're selecting areas to be avoiding those areas which typically appeal to that sort of, the students, where you're buying right next to a university, where all the apartments that are being sold in those complexes are, being rented to students or to overseas migrants or temporary people that are here temporarily. So what we've seen over the COVID period is that the areas where you've sort of got that, a lot of overseas travelers or, temporary students are the areas where you've seen the biggest effect on the rental market. We've found that, areas like the eastern suburbs of Sydney, where you typically had a lot of people coming from overseas and living for a couple of years, those were the ones which were hurt the most in the rental, from a rental side of things, and also in Melbourne, where you had extended lockdowns and things which impacted the markets. Now, on the other hand, areas like Newcastle, areas like the Sunshine Coast, areas like Brisbane, they've all seen a real tightening of their rental markets. And the reason for that is those areas aren't typically attracting those overseas travelers. They're typically attracting owner occupiers and people that are moving out of our other CBDs. Now, one thing COVID's done is it's offsetting that loss. We've also had the return of thousands and thousands of expats. I think there was a report that we've already had 363,000 people return, and that was in July. Now, that's one of the key things. But the other key thing to consider is property investment's a long-term strategy. So you don't want to be too focused on the short term. Now, if we look past sort of 2020 and 2021, Scott Morrison's also highlighted migration as a key part of the economic recovery. So we're likely to see a real boost of that net migration over the coming years, which will have a real strong impact on our property markets. And where our migration generally occurs is on the eastern seaboard. So that's essentially where we focus. Now, our nation is going to be much more desirable than a lot of other countries come the end of this COVID period, because the way we've dealt with it has been, miles ahead of most other countries. So we see that that's going to be a key contributor. But the key thing to take note here is that although we've lost a lot of our net migration, most areas where avoiding areas where you've got lots of overseas travelers or temporary visas and things like that dominate that population, we actually haven't seen a rise in vacancies or fall in rentals in those tightly held owner-occupier areas. So that's where you should be focusing. Now, one of the other reasons why we haven't seen such a bad effect was because supply was already slowing. Rising construction costs, limitations on foreign investment, APRA lending changes, these all things led to supply slowing over the last few years. So if you see the graph on the right, you'll notice that in 2017, the column was the highest. Since then, it's been on a pretty steady decline. And what COVID's done as well is we've seen lots of developers holding back new developments, which means that all the supply that was meant to come onto the market has kind of not come onto the market. Now, the Financial Review reported that Sydney's new apartment marketing had fallen 84% from its 2016 peak. So despite losing a lot of that population growth, we've also lost a lot of supply. So they've kind of balanced themselves out. And we've also seen the number of new building commencements has fallen 57% as well. So what we've found basically so far is that we've lost a lot from the population growth perspective, but we've also lost a lot from a supply perspective, which has sort of held the market in good stead. And like I said, where we've had a lot of demand increasing is from those sort of regional coastal centres, which have an employment base, but also have a lifestyle and that affordability factor which drive those markets. Now, like I mentioned, from a vacancy rate perspective, the capital city rental markets, this just sort of looks at the vacancy rates. Now, a vacancy rate measures basically how many properties are vacant relative to how many properties are on the rental market. Now, you'll see here in the first, on the left side of the graph, Melbourne's had an increase from being one of the tightest vacancy rates or rental markets in the country. It's increased from about 2% to sort of 3.7%. And one of the reasons for that, it's not disastrous, but one of the reasons for that is because of the lockdowns, there was a real inability to take people through open homes and things like that, which affected that rental market. So essentially we had a build-up of property supply, but that will get soaked up pretty quickly. And once we do start to see migration come back into play, that'll all be soaked up very quickly. Now, we still think that there's some really strong pockets in Melbourne. One of the other things or trends that we saw was young people who had moved out of home to live closer to cities or closer to work or closer to the bars and restaurants and things. They sort of returned home through COVID with that uncertainty around employment and things like that. So what we'll find is as we sort of come through it as a nation, a lot of those people who were living out of home will probably go back to that arrangement, and that'll soak up a lot of that supply as well. Now, Sydney's increased marginally, but if you notice here on the sort of right-hand side, Newcastle's dropped dramatically. It's now under 1%. It's just over 0.5%. Brisbane's dropped from 2.8 to 2%, and the Sunshine Coast has dropped from 2.3 to 0.5%. So what we've seen is in those markets, there's been a real shift, and a couple of reasons. People are bringing forward their sea change plans. One of the things we've noticed is a lot of people have that view of moving to Newcastle or moving to the Sunshine Coast for that lifestyle aspect as they get closer to retirement. But knowing how well these sort of regions have dealt with the COVID scenario, it's kind of brought forward those sea change plans, along with the fact that people can now work from home, 2 days a week, or work from home 4 days a week and only go into the office 1 day a week. So it's very feasible to live in the Sunshine Coast and travel an hour to Brisbane, or live in Newcastle and travel to Sydney, or live in the Central Coast. So all of those sort of regional areas, we've seen a real improvement over this period. Now, just from a rental side of things, one of the key conversations or common conversations I have with clients over the period is, is the property going to get rented, and sort of what's the rental market like? Now, these are the last 10 properties that our clients have purchased, and these 10 are in Brisbane, so Newport, Taringa, Greenslopes, and Chapel Hill. Now, most of them are townhouses. There's one apartment and one house. But what you'll find here is that the rental yield has generally fluctuated between 4.6 and 4.9%, which are really high returns, especially given the current interest rate environment. The lowest rental yield here is 4.1%, but that was on a $1.2 million property. Now, just for some context, there was a $1.2 million property sold in my street, and it's been rented for $640 a week in Sydney. So the rental yields in Sydney are nowhere near as strong as what they are in, say, Brisbane. And what that's enabling people to do is it's enabling investors to buy into these really high quality properties where you're not seeing rents tailor away, and hold on to them for the long term at literally no cost. So this is where we're kind of seeing an opportunity. And as we start to see people moving to Brisbane, moving to Sunshine Coast, moving to Newcastle, the demand's likely to pick up. And with supply slowing so significantly, we're definitely likely to see an increase in that rental price, but also an increase in capital growth. So basically, this slide is just to show that not only have they all achieved really strong rentals, but the rental results were achieved pre-settlement in almost all the cases. So we're seeing clients purchase, they've got sort of 14 days from their exchange to their purchase, and within that 14 days, the rents are being the tenants are being secured, which is a really strong sign for overall demand. And not all of Brisbane would have performed like this, but the areas that we're typically looking at are very established areas, very tightly held areas with minimal new supply. Because a big focus of ours is on that supply piece and ensuring that you don't have an oversupply in those areas. We don't want to be in areas where you've got thousands and thousands of apartments coming onto the market, or thousands of townhouses. So we typically focus on really boutique projects of 4 or 5 townhouses, or 20 or 30 townhouses in areas where supply is limited, rather than looking at blocks of 200 apartments where you've got no real limitation on supply. And that's kind of our focus. Our focus is always to be on that boutique type products, which are appealing to owner occupiers. And generally you'll find that a smaller development is something that appeals more to an owner occupier than something that's much larger. Now, that's all the rental side, but from a value perspective, we've also seen a fairly strong performance from all the markets. Now, on the left-hand side is the change in dwelling values from the 3 months to October 2020. So from end of June to October 2020, the broader Australian property market sort of came back to 0.1%, which is kind of nothing. But all of our capital city markets, except for Sydney and Melbourne, saw positive growth. So even in the midst of the COVID pandemic, all the capital city markets, except for Sydney and Melbourne, saw an increase in their prices. Now, Melbourne fell 2.2% and Sydney fell 0.6%, both which are essentially non-events. Now, if we look at, to give some perspective, if we look at the change in dwelling values for the 12 months to October 2020, so from October 2019 to October 2020, each capital city market has actually increased. Sydney's increased 6.1%, Melbourne was 0.7% up. So one of the key things with property is to keep that perspective. If you isolate certain timeframes in certain periods of time over a longer time frame, you're always going to see this sort of volatility in the results. But when you look at generally speaking, when you look at a sort of 12, 24, 5-year period, you'll notice that all the property markets do quite well. and they generally go through cycles of strong periods of growth and then periods of sort of stagnation, and that's kind of what we found. But broadly speaking, over the COVID period, the property markets have basically been unaffected, essentially. If anything, there's been certain areas where demand's picked up even more. Now, just looking at the current state of the markets, so here we've got the median house prices in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and Perth, and we've tracked them from 1970 every 10 years up until 2020. Now, you'll notice that sort of each and every market has increased significantly over the period. But if we focus just on 2020 to 2010, to 2020, so the last 10 years, you'll notice that Sydney's done exceptionally well. It's from 624,000 to 925,000. Melbourne's also done really well from 560 to 700. Brisbane's done okay from 460 to 535, and then Perth's actually gone backwards. Now, the reason for Perth going backwards is that reliance on the mining sector. And like I mentioned before, our focus is on the east coast of Australia because, one, we like to travel very frequently to the destinations which we're recommending property in so that we can understand those markets at a really deep level. But two, because all of our population growth is headed to those three cities. We're typically seeing all of our infrastructure investment, or a large portion of it, is being spent on the east coast. So if that's where all the jobs are, that's generally where people are moving, and that's kind of where we focus. Now, where do we see opportunity? So the conversation we always have is generally with Sydney-siders. We're based in Sydney, so we're generally speaking to people who live in Sydney. And the Sydney property market is always very well speculated. You know, we're constantly talking about how that market's performing. So I just want to show this slide, which shows the average annual growth rates over certain periods of time, because I think it really shows the sort of cyclical nature of property markets. And if you can understand the different cycles and sort of predict the different cycles, then it can sort of enhance your overall investment strategy. So between 1984 and 1990, the average annual growth rate was around 13%. Now, that doesn't mean it grows at 13% per annum, but it might be 20%, 10%, and that's the kind of average over that 5 or 6 year period. Then we sort of had 8 years at 3.3%, then 5 years at 13% again, and then 7 years at 1.2%, and then more recently 5 years at 13%. And now, if you notice, between 2018 or late 2017, 2018, nothing's actually happened in the property market in Sydney. We've kind of fluctuated. We've gone up and down. There's been little bumps and increases over the period. But essentially, if you bought a property at the end of 2017 in the peak, you're probably not selling it for any more than what you bought it for. And what that shows is that we are going through that correction or stagnation period. And generally speaking, those periods last sort of 7 or 8 years. So if we're not looking at Sydney, where are we kind of looking? Now, we sort of see opportunities, like I said, along that east coast. And one of the main ones for us, and the one which I'll sort of talk through a little bit more today, is the Brisbane and the Sunshine Coast, or the Queensland market. Just from a time perspective, I can't go through everything in too much detail. But the reasons why we like Brisbane and the Sunshine Coast is interstate migration is really strong. Infrastructure investment is really strong. It's still got a really strong affordability in comparison to Sydney. And the cyclical nature of the cycles, I'll show you in a few slides, but generally we see Brisbane benefit when Sydney slows down. So they're sort of, in a nutshell, the key reasons there. Newcastle, again, affordability is a key driver there. People moving out. We frequently talk to people who are moving out of, or plan to move out of Sydney to move into Newcastle. So that affordability piece is still driving that market up there, but also the transitioning economy. It's gone away from being a sort of mining region to a real region that's focused on healthcare and education as their main employers, and that really is driving that market. And again, the migration and relocation, which is being driven by those two things. And then Melbourne's an interesting one. It's typically had the strongest population growth from an overseas perspective for a number of years. Now, obviously, that's going to be slowed for the next next 2 years, whilst we've got these restrictions on travel. And we don't know how long that will last, but that population growth will be sure to come back, and Melbourne will continue to grow. It's just a matter of picking the right areas, because there are some pockets of Melbourne which are really, really oversupplied that you want to avoid. The other thing about Melbourne is the market segmentation. So unlike Sydney's seen house prices rise significantly and apartment prices have basically followed. Melbourne's kind of a little bit different, where house prices rose fairly significantly, but the amount of supply on the market kind of slowed the growth in the apartment market. So the gap between houses and apartments has now reached a historic peak. So there's no doubt that will play a little bit of catch up, and we're likely to see those apartments do quite well. But again, it's just about picking the right areas. So basically, the one that I'll focus on is Brisbane and the sunny coast and southeast Queensland. But this just shows the sort of relationship between Sydney and Brisbane. Now, between 2002 and 2011, Brisbane did 143% and Sydney did 27%. So Brisbane significantly outperformed Sydney over that period. And then in 2011 to 2018, Sydney doubled at 100% and Brisbane did 24%. And we'll generally see that cycle repeat itself over time, where Sydney outdoes Brisbane and then Brisbane plays catch up and outdoes Sydney. And that's likely what we're to start to see over the next few years. But what drives that is net interstate migration. So this graph here, the two lines, the black line at the bottom being New South Wales and the darker blue line at the top being Queensland, you'll notice that the lines are basically symmetrical. So when people are leaving New South Wales, they're generally ending up in Queensland. And if people aren't leaving New South Wales, or a lesser amount of people are leaving New South Wales, Queensland are generally benefiting from a lower amount of net interstate migration. So basically what this graph does is it looks at the number of people moving to New South Wales from other states and the number of people leaving New South Wales to move to other states, and it works out a net position. So New South Wales is always losing people to net interstate migration, where overall we're gaining from overseas migration. But where most of the people in New South Wales move to is that Queensland market. And what we generally see is when Sydney gets very expensive, we start to see that interstate migration rise, or we start to see more people leave New South Wales and Queensland starts gaining more people. So if we look back here to 2002, 2003, 2004, that was the last time Sydney peaked before this more recent boom cycle. And what happened there was when Sydney got really expensive, people start to look for more affordable alternatives. The younger people who are starting a family who can't afford to pay for a house in the areas that they'd like to live in Sydney decide to pack up and move to Queensland. Now, Queensland's a smaller population, but what happens is that the impact of that interstate migration is far more significant up there. And we start to see a real strong demand shift there, and the supply remains quite slow, and prices in Queensland start to increase. So when I talk about New South Wales and Queensland, most the areas that are benefiting from this migration is Sunshine Coast, the Gold Coast, and Brisbane. Predominantly Brisbane, but those two sort of regional markets benefit as well. But basically, when you see at the end of the graph, we're starting to get to that point again, where New South Wales, the amount of people Queensland's gaining has been increasing, and the amount of people New South Wales is losing has been increasing as well. So we're heading towards the same sort of trajectory. Now, this is kind of what drives that move. It's that affordability piece. So what this graph shows here is that the percentage of Brisbane's median house price to Sydney. So essentially here in 1980, Brisbane's median house price was 51% of Sydney's. So basically half the price. Now, what we typically see is that it fluctuates between around that 50 mark and then around anywhere between sort of 70 and 85%. So starts off Brisbane's median house price is 72% of Sydney's. So it's kind of, there's a gap there, but it's not as significant. Then we drop down, Sydney's house prices go really strong, and we drop down to that 51%. And you can kind of see how they bounce between those two figures over time. But more recently, in 2010 or 2011, after that period where Brisbane grew at 143% that I talked through just before, Brisbane's median house price had caught up to Sydney's. So it was only marginally lower than Sydney's median house price. But as a result of the recent growth we've had in Sydney, we're now back down to that sort of 56% mark. So that incentive to leave is there again. You know, people are looking up at Queensland and they're thinking, well, I can sell my $1 million home in Sydney and I can either go up there and buy something equivalent for $500,000, or I can sell my $1 million home in Sydney, which is probably just in an average area, and buy a very premium home in Brisbane for $1 million. So that's one of the key drivers. And then also the other thing is with the infrastructure pipeline in Brisbane at the moment, people are typically earning just as much for certain jobs up in Queensland. You know, engineers in Queensland are earning more than what they're earning in Sydney because there's such strong demand for them up there. So it makes a lot of sense for that movement in migration, and that's really what drives the Brisbane market. So this is one of the key things that we're seeing as a main driver, and there's a couple of other things as well, but again, just being wary of the time. You know, it's the infrastructure investment that's going on. It's the affordability. It's the wider population growth. It's the various projects that are impacting various areas of Brisbane. The Queen's Wharf redevelopment is a major casino precinct, which is making Brisbane a bit more of a world city. You've got expansions to the airport. The Sunshine Coast is converting to an international airport, and all these things are driving that movement up to Brisbane. So just on a few other things around key traps to avoid when you are investing, and we typically see this a fair bit because a lot of our clients introduced to us are already thinking about investment, and they've already sort of done a bit of their own research, and they've already come up with some, they've used the media to guide them as to what areas they should be looking at. And then they've sort of been guided by that and looking at those areas. But one of the key things to avoid, and this comes back to the first point, which I mentioned when we started, is just understanding the difference between an owner-occupier type product and an investor-grade product. Now, I've just used 2 apartments here as examples, but on the right-hand side, you'll see a 66 square metre apartment with a 10 square metre balcony. You'll notice, if you can see the floor plan, that the kitchen has no island bench. The bedroom at the front, which has a lot of natural light, is actually the second bedroom. The main bedroom is only getting light from a little light well, and it's quite small as well. But the kitchen, dining and living is all sort of blended together, so you kind of get a bit of a studio type feel. Now, you're not going to have an owner-occupier, a young family, walk into there and go, you know what, wow, I'd love to live in an apartment like this. So yes, you'll get a rental return, but it's not the type of property that's going to attract an owner-occupier. So we always avoid these types of properties. These are the types of apartments that you'll generally see in a block of 300 or 400 apartments where they've all been cut up the exact same way, and they're all being sold to either overseas investors or investors inside Australia. But they're just not being sold to owner-occupiers. So one of the key things we look for when we're looking at projects is understanding how many owner-occupiers have purchased in there, and understanding if it's got that owner-occupier appeal. Now, this example on the left-hand side is another 2-bedroom apartment. It's 93 square metres. It's got a 20 square metre balcony, but you'll notice it's got a nice big kitchen with an island bench. It's got a nice big dining area, which is separated from your living area. And then you've got your 2 bedrooms on either side of the apartment with lots of natural light. It's actually a corner apartment. So buying off the plan can sometimes allow you to get access to the better properties within a development. This was in a small block of 35 apartments, as opposed to a block of 200 apartments. Now, these were all sold off the plan. So if you were to wait till they're completed, you actually can't get access to them. But the reason why we like it is it's a functional design. It's large, it's wide, it's got lots of natural light, and an owner-occupier would walk in there and they could easily raise 1 or 2 kids in an apartment like that. So they're the types of things that we're sort of looking for. And you can make those mistakes on houses, apartments and townhouses if you don't look for the right things. So one of the key things to look for, and probably the most important one, is size. One of the aspects of an apartment which you can never change is how big it is. So if you get that wrong from the start, that can kind of be really detrimental to your overall property strategy. And it's sort of, these are important because although you'll be able to rent, if you're in a good location, you'll kind of be able to rent either one. You're generally going to get a lot more turnover of tenants in the one on the right because people are going to outgrow that space. And when they have the ability, they're going to upgrade. But also, when it comes time to sell the properties, you're going to have a lot more demand for the one on the left than you are going to have for the one on the right. So that's a key consideration. Now,
sorry, Dom.
Yes.
Dom, just make sure there's a distinction that, yes, these are both properties for investment. You're just looking at properties that most owner-occupiers would want to rent.
Yes.
So that's really important. So it's not for the person investing to live in as an owner-occupier. It's for them actually to rent it to an owner-occupier.
So when I talk about owner-occupiers versus investors, we're both talking about investing in these properties. So whether you're investing in the one on the left or the one on the right, but the one on the left as an investment property is going to perform better because it will appeal to a potential owner-occupier down the line, but it'll also appeal to more of a larger portion of the rental population too. So it's just about picking the right types of properties. Now, this is just an example of how different the performance can be. And this is 2 suburbs in Sydney. So one being Maroubra and one being Zetland. Now they're both 2-bedroom apartments. They were both purchased in November 2009 and they were both resold in August 2018. So they both were held over the exact same time frame. The one in Maroubra, there's nothing too special about it, but it is a smaller block. And what you'll find is in Maroubra, there's far less supply that gets brought onto that market. Developers aren't able to be as active as what they might be in a Zetland, for example. Now, this property on the left was bought for $875 and sold for $1.6 million. So it grew at 85%. So there's a lot of misconceptions out there that apartments don't grow. But if you buy an apartment in the right area with the right characteristics, you're definitely able to achieve really strong growth. Now, where you often see people go wrong in apartments is in properties like this one on the right in Zetland, where you've got thousands and thousands of Meriton units that are continuously brought onto this market. There's no limitation on that supply. And generally, these properties are being sold to investors. So you're in buildings that are just full of other investors and full of tenants, which isn't ideal. You don't have, if you're someone who's looking to buy a property to live in yourself, and you walk through a development and you see that there's all 4 lease signs all over the building, and you can tell that it's just got a tenant feel because things haven't been looked after as nice as what you would if you were living there. This can sort of be detrimental to that building's reputation over time. So this one on the right was sold for $670 in the same month and resold for $865 in 2018 in the exact same month as one on the left. So exact same market conditions. Zetland and Maroubra are only sort of 15 odd minutes away from each other, and it grew at 29%. So 2 very different performances just based on the location in which you invest within a market. So the key thing to highlight here is that despite investing in Sydney or Brisbane or the Sunshine Coast or Melbourne or Newcastle, there are little markets within those markets that you need to consider. And there'll be markets within, there's markets all over the country, but the markets within the same capital city market can perform very differently. Maroubra has performed very differently to Zetland. Zetland has performed very differently to, say, Blacktown. All these areas have sort of their own micro market, but understanding those little disparities and differences is key to making the right decisions when you're investing. And that's kind of where we see ourselves as adding value, because we travel so frequently. We spend the time walking through streets, talking to locals, talking to local cafe owners, just getting a feel for an area so that we can understand the areas that we're recommending just as well as what we would understand the areas that we're living in. And this is an example of just houses and 2 different scenarios as well. So on the top here, we've got a suburb called Ormeau, and both these suburbs sit within the Gold Coast and Brisbane, between that sort of corridor. Now, Ormeau is a suburb where you've had lots of owner-occupiers live there. There's not a lot of new development. There hasn't been many new house and land estates that have been built. They're a little bit larger blocks, lots of nice families, lots of nice schools, all that type of thing. That's kind of the demographic. And then Coomera is directly to the south of Ormeau, so the next suburb down. But Coomera has had a lot of land available where developers have gone in and built lots of new estates. And lots of investors have bought into these estates. And for anyone who doesn't know where this is, Coomera is where the theme parks are in Queensland, in the Gold Coast. So Movie World and Dream World and those sorts of areas. But what's happened is there was a new town centre being built, there was a new train line, and people bought into this new infrastructure as being a key driver for property growth. But what happened was all the supply that was brought on was sold to overseas investors or sold to interstate investors. So you've got these new house and land estates of 1,000 lots, and you walk through the estates, none of the lawns are mowed. You've got the houses are looking a bit run down. People just don't take care of them. So they've all been sold to investors, and what that's done is it's brought down the view or the reputation of the suburb. So between 2006 and 2019, this property in Ormeau grew 47%. Between 2008 and 2019, this property in Coomera went down 16%. So people read these sort of scenarios on the bottom and automatically think that whole Brisbane or Gold Coast corridor is one where you're not going to achieve capital growth. But really, if you just invested in the right sort of pocket of that region, you're still able to get that strong performance. So in a nutshell, these are the types of things that we look for, and we kind of started that as a top to bottom approach. So understanding the market cycles, understanding the markets within those markets, and avoiding the areas where you've got lots of investors buying, and focusing on the areas where lots of owner occupiers are buying, so that you can invest in and be among lots of owner occupiers. Because the ideal scenario is that you buy an investment property that in 10, 15 years time, if you need to sell it, you can sell it to someone who's going to want to live there, rather than be limited to someone who is also looking for an investment property. Now, I'll hand over to Mark, and if there's any questions, we can cover them at the end. But this is kind of just a little bit around the numbers around the timing of the current market.
Thanks, Dom. I just wanted to highlight, and I should appreciate everything Dom's said so far, because there's a real science around property, and from anyone who's tried to buy a property and the weekends are wasted and going to auctions and trying to read it, when you realise there's people who are specialised in this area, and it's, as I said, a real science. So I appreciate everything Dom's set up today, and hopefully everyone's learned something from that. But just this is for me, from doing the numbers, that really appeals. And just 8 years ago in 2012, if we just take a property that was worth 500,000, stamp duty 20,000, and yes, we're seeing that in New South Wales, that stamp duty changing, and you put down a 10% deposit. So the total loan amount was 470. So we're just trying to keep apples to apples. Back then, interest rate was 6%. And so the cost of that was 37,000. If you take 4.5%, which as Dom showed, that's not unrealistic. The income was 21,000. And therefore, the before tax annual cash flow was minus 15,000. And that's what everyone's been talking about. Gee, last 40 years is negative gearing, is that you're having the cost of your loan. It was helped out by getting rent, but you would still have a loss overall. And in this example, it'd be 15,000. And the government said, well, if you make a loss on an investment, we'll give you a tax deduction, and therefore it's negatively geared. The offset of that is they receive capital gains tax whenever you sell the property. So, but saying that, there is actually an after-tax benefit because there is tax deductions of depreciation on properties. So an actual after-tax of actual cash flow there in that example was minus 5,472. So not too bad. You've just got to come up with that minus 5,000 and you've got a property there. But in 2020, let's have a look at that and drop down to the interest rate. That's 2.7% per annum interest at the moment. And to give you some idea, as we see interest rates, this could even drop or at least stay this way for the next 3-5 years because you can get fixed level rates now that are pretty close to that figure. So obviously the banks don't see any major increases. And so that makes a big difference. The annual expenses now are only 21,000 and the rental income is 21,913. So before the tax deductions, you're already in a positive $243. But once you claim your tax deduction, you actually end up in positive of $4,614. So in 50 years, this has never happened. So this is why this is such an amazing period of time we're in, where you've got a property that's going to grow at whatever price. But at the end of the day, it's not actually costing you anything because as long as you've got good tenants, it will cover the cost of the expense of the interest and other expenses plus the tax deduction so that you actually end up with a positive cash flow. That's something that has just not been heard of. And it just really, as I said, that's only 8 years ago with the negative gearing. And even the election, the last election, one of the Labor points they were pointing with that to get rid of negative gearing. Well, we don't even really need negative gearing because everyone at the moment is positively geared. So yes, it's important to get a strong rental income to do that, but these low interest rates are going to be around for the next few years. If you could go on, Dom. And sorry, there is a lot more detail that goes in with those numbers. And if anyone wants to go into the real nitty-gritty of that, we can obviously help with that, and so could Dom. I just wanted to give just a real quick comparison of 2012 to 2020 and why there is a real opportunity now and for the next couple of years. And just from our own services, I really want to on just a couple of them, and just mortgage broking. For the first 20 years of being in business, we went through our normal bank as most people do, but really mortgage broking the last 10 years has come into its own. And you having someone who's there on your behalf, not the banks, working, and we just had an email from a client today where on the weekend they had to settle on a property down the south coast, and the bank wasn't playing ball to get it, and they needed to settle, and the mortgage broker stepped in and fixed it for them and got it there. So a mortgage broker will help you if you wanted to get a loan to say, well, do you need an offset account? Do you need this interest only? Do you this? And here are the pros and cons of each. Whereas if you go to your bank, they will say, do you want a loan or don't you want a loan? So there's a real, I definitely, whatever broker this is, I definitely see the benefits of having a mortgage broker compared to just going to a normal bank. Wealth coaching, as you can see from the infographic there, this is something we're doing for a lot of our clients who are either retirees or pre-retirees, and they've got adult kids, getting their basics on the savings, getting debt under control, getting their super and all this. We've got Rosh from our office who's providing some core wealth coaching, and that's been quite popular. We just basically don't want our clients, especially their kids, living paycheck to paycheck, and there is better ways of saving if you just put a few things in plan. And the last one is year R planning. We call it year R because the old standard term of calling it retirement, well, retirement isn't turning 65 and then having long walks on a beach and playing golf every day. It's just not. People still want to keep on working. Still people want to travel, do a lot of other things. So year R means different things to different people, and it's just a different phase of your life and next big adventure. And so we're really enjoying helping our clients work out that what that is. Financially, we'll help them get there, but also just helping look at what that means. Year R is just the next big thing. So we are enjoying that. So they're just some of the services that Noel can provide in helping our clients. And so as a final note, just on this webinar, because we'll just take some questions. This is being recorded, so you'll see all the slides in here. So happy to provide a copy of this or the link to this presentation. But if there's anyone else you know might be interested in this property update that couldn't get to this meeting and getting all that information that Dom's provided, yeah, it's all there. It's all there, and just let us know. Okay, so from one comment, yep, Sam being on a beach sounds in year R sounds really good. Yes, it really does. And I think this weekend, that's where most of us will be. If there's any other questions, they're coming there to Dom or myself. I should actually say Dom didn't mention, but most people would like to know how much, say, property advocates like Benari, and we use 3 different property advocates for our clients, what type of costs they would have. Most we've seen usually charge an upfront fee, and it can anywhere be between $10,000–$15,000. Benari do it a bit differently, and there's the technical reasons why. But everyone, if you buy a property, of course, you've got an agent and they take a fee. Well, Benari, because they're sourcing these properties from agents, the agent pay Benari rather than you pay Benari. So Benari definitely get paid, but it's not directly out of your pocket. Saying that, the other property advocates we have, while they get paid an upfront fee, obviously are there negotiating the best possible deal for you. So it's still good value, whichever way you use, and it's as horses for courses. But Benari definitely get paid, but they get paid by the agent of the local property.
Yeah, just on that, we basically, there's 2 ways you can go, like Mark said. One is to charge your purchases, essentially, and then one is to work under like a traditional real estate agent under the real estate license. And we're licensed in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland. And the way we act is to, the properties that we're generally looking at are being sold by, say, a local Ray White or a local LJ Hooker. Rather than that Ray White or LJ Hooker being paid, we would redirect that fee to us to ensure that we don't need to charge the client, but we're able to get into the properties. There's no extra cost buying a property through Benari as there is to buying a property through the local agent. Basically, there's the exact same price, but it's just a way to sort of remove that kind of barrier of entry for our clients to ensure that we can, they're able to purchase the property they want without having to outlay those fees. So that's the way we've gone about it.
Okay, and to save Rosh saying, the one question is how to get in contact with you, Dom. We'll just, anyone who wants that, we can definitely provide Dom and Benari's details. So we'll be happy to do that. From Victoria, how much do you need to get started in investment property? Excellent question, Dom.
Yeah, look, it just depends. I mean, it kind of depends on the way in which you'd go about your purchase. And this is where it's important to speak to either your financial planner or your mortgage broker. But we'd welcome the conversation, to have the conversation with you as well. It's kind of, in a simple version, you need an amount for a deposit. And that deposit, however much you've got saved, might determine the price point in which you can look at. Generally speaking, you'd run off having a 10% deposit and maybe some money for stamp duty. So, we've got clients who have sort of $45,000 in savings plus $20,000 for their stamp duty, so $65,000. You'd be able to probably get a property, but it's all, this is talking very generally. It depends on your circumstances, depends on your income, depends on all those types of things. So from how much do you need to get started, it's best to talk to a broker or a financial planner. And we're always happy to have the chat as well and get an understanding of your scenario, but it's best to understand through that, to be honest.
And give 2 possible scenarios that we've been doing in probably the last 2 years for our clients, especially our clients' children, adult children. You can buy, it's exactly the scenario one is exactly as Dom said, the 10% deposit plus the cost of the stamp duty, and they will have properties that they will have the range, wherever it is, Newcastle, Brisbane, Sunny Coast. The other scenario that's quite popular is to actually, especially if it's off a plan and it may take a year to be built, that Benari know of these opportunities and know the type that are available, and you would put a 10% holding deposit for that, and allows you then the next 12 months while the property is getting built to save up for the stamp duty. So you've got the deposit already because you've got 10%, or you can save up to try and get 20% deposit when you eventually have to get the mortgage and buy the property in 12 months time. But at least you've got a property on hold for 10, 12 months, which is actually locked in at that price. So if it grows in the next 12 months, you get that already. So that's one area that people like, that gets them a property locked in right now, but they don't actually have to worry about the mortgage, the stamp duty, or however much more than the 10% they want to have as a deposit in 10 to 12 months time.
Yeah.
Okay, I think, there's one more from Tracy. Hi, Tracy. So in Brisbane, are we best to buy sooner rather than later based on your cycle, or the cycles that you've just been playing, or is it, I suppose it's the area in Brisbane?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the area within Brisbane. You know, I wouldn't just say go out and buy anything in Brisbane, or buy, just because of, you can see how different sort of pockets can perform. I do think that we're going through a period now where Brisbane is really heating up, just from conversations that we're having with local agents, conversations that we're having with property managers and people that are located in Brisbane. It's getting a lot tighter. It's getting a lot harder to buy properties. The days on market are reducing. All those sort of anecdotal signs that we start to see at the beginning of a bit of a growth cycle. And I think what COVID has done is it's brought forward probably that Brisbane cycle, because we are starting to see a lot of people move up there, and that's creating that demand. So I definitely think now is kind of the right time. People have been saying it's the right time to buy in Queensland for a number of years now. But we're really starting to see all the signs which we typically look for, which are, those falling vacancy rates, rising rental returns, decreasing days on markets, all those types of things. So it is starting to get to that point where we feel that it's a really strong time to be buying. The markets go through cycles. So when Brisbane does have that increase in its prices, there'll be other markets around the country that where the opportunities are. But at the moment, if someone asked me where I sort of thought the best opportunities were, it's in that sort of southeast Queensland market, as well as sort of pockets of Newcastle and some pockets of Melbourne too.
Just one more from Victoria saying, are you concerned with the JobKeeper ending? I
mean, it's an interesting one. People have been sort of worried about that for a fair while now, but and it kind of comes down again to where you're investing. What we've found is that the JobKeeper has obviously helped a lot of people in that hospitality industry or in the retail industry where they were really affected by it. But broadly speaking, a lot of the businesses are kind of returning back to normal. And typically the people that you're up against when it comes to buy a property in these rural owner-occupier areas are not the people that have ended up on JobKeeper. The other thing is offsetting the loss of JobKeeper is the ridiculously low interest rate environment that we're in, which is enabling people to hold on to their properties much easier. So I don't think that's going to be a concern. I think the way the market's headed, if you're buying into those areas where it's a fairly affluent demographic, they're sort of employed by the key sort of employment nodes of healthcare and education and those more stable kind of jobs, we're probably going to be fine. It's going to depend on the areas, areas like, the eastern suburbs where lots of people, or there's the very affluent part of the eastern suburbs, but then there's also that sort of holidaying part of the eastern suburbs and the people who are here from England or here from other parts of Europe and are working part-time in bars and restaurants and things, who are renting a place there. With JobKeeper coming out, or them losing their jobs, there was a rise in vacancies and there was a influx of rental properties coming onto the market. So the rental market was kind of affected, but the sort of home market and the more higher priced properties have held their values quite well, because we haven't really seen that have that much effect. So it just depends, I think, where you're investing in terms of how big that impact will be. But largely, I think we're sort of headed back to normality the way we're going. I mean, restrictions are easing in New South Wales. Restrictions in Brisbane have eased a fair bit already. So I think we'll be okay from that perspective.
Not sure if you can see this questions there, Dom, but Celeste has asked, would you mind speaking briefly on the first homeowner grant?
Yeah, so I mean, the first homeowner grant is really good for owner occupiers essentially. So most of what we're focused on is investors, so they're not actually eligible for the first homeowner grant. So the first homeowner grant you're only able to actually get access to if you're buying a home to live in. Now, typically, because we're working with lots of Sydney-based clients, we work with clients all over the place, but most of our clients are based in Sydney. If they're buying in Southeast Queensland, they're not eligible for the first homeowner grant. I do know there's a fair few restrictions around who's applicable for the first homeowner grant. I think there's some price boundaries and income things like that can sort of impact whether you're eligible or not. But it's obviously a great benefit, and I think it's in Brisbane. If you're living in Queensland and you wanted to buy something as a first home, I think you can get sort of $25,000 if you buy something off the plan, which is obviously a great benefit. It kind of helps you with that stamp duty portion, or helps you get a sort of kickstart on the deposit. So it's definitely beneficial if you're buying to live in, but just most of our clients are buying as investments, so they're not able to get that.
And just on that also, that yes, because Celeste, I know you're in Queensland, so therefore, if it was happen to be a place near where you actually want to live, there's not actually a problem that you can be the owner occupier of this property. It's just the majority of people are looking at this from investment, and just also from the stamp duty perspective, that's looking to be changed in New South Wales. That is only for New South Wales property. So even if you're in New South Wales, but if you buy a property outside New South Wales, the stamp duty is definitely as per the state it's in, so not available there. I should also say, yeah, how other property, people are actually looking at, well, I want to actually buy my own home and this is the area I want to do, but I just don't have time to do that. That's probably more where a property and other type of property advocates work, while these are more, as Dom says, an area looking for investment opportunities for people who are, looking to buy a property but don't necessarily want to live there in the majority of occasions. Now, one of the things is also I should say is that, because people are saying, if we want to speak to Dom, and I definitely feel that you can see the science and the education that's behind it. It's definitely worthwhile spending an hour talking to Dom and hearing the stuff he knows, and you can just see he loves property. But yeah, any first meeting with ourselves and Dom and all that doesn't cost you anything, whether that's Zoom or in person, now that we can start seeing people again in person. So yeah, now if there's any inquiries about this, but property is usually the biggest purchase anyone makes, so it's important to get some really good advice around buying property. But definitely, as I said at the very beginning, we've never seen interest rates as low as they are. And while good rental, as long as you find good property with good rental, it definitely makes the maths of it makes very positive, because it's positively geared rather than negatively geared. Now, I promised everyone it would not be more than an hour, and I think everyone has pretty well, 6:58, so 2 minutes ago. If there's any final words, Dom, you would like to say before I sign off?
No, thanks again, Mark, for the opportunity, and I hope everyone sort of got something out of it. And like Mark said, I'm sure he'll shoot over my details if anyone has any questions, or it doesn't need to be about property investment. If you had some questions around buying your own home, or just any questions around an existing property portfolio or properties you might be looking at, more than happy to help, given the relationship I've got with Mark. So happy to sort of give my advice on sort of any aspect of the property market. So yeah, look forward to chatting to anyone who's interested. But thanks again for the opportunity, and I hope sort of covered off some of the questions you might have had. Thanks,
Dom. Okay, and thanks everyone for joining in. And as I said, this webinar will be available. We're recording this, and so if you'll be provided a link to it. But yeah, very happy if you want to share that to anyone else who you feel may be interested. It's just a really interesting topic. Property as it is any time, but at the moment, it's especially with such low interest rates. So everyone have a good evening, and definitely wear plenty of block out this weekend, I feel. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, guys. See you later.
Bye-bye.